Hey, it's John Lee Dumas of EO Fire, and it's the Entrepreneurial You, the show for dedicated and passionate Caribbean entrepreneurs seeking daily inspiration, brought to you by author, speaker, and award-winning entrepreneur Heneka Watkis-Porter. You must be prepared to ignite.
Coming up on this episode of the Entrepreneurial You.
WhatsApp in India is what mailing lists are everywhere else globally. It's such a no-brainer.
Welcome back to the Entrepreneurial You. I'm your host, Heneka Watkis-Porter. Our guest today is based in Bangalore, India. He is the co-founder of Kamakshi Media, creator of Baalgatha podcast of classic children's stories, and author of the Amol Dixit series of books. Interestingly, he has lived in 15 cities over the past 20 years. This, of course, includes the 2 years spent at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign as a graduate student and the time spent at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, for his MBA. I'm happy to welcome Amar Vyas. Welcome, Amar, to the Entrepreneurial You.
Well, thank you so much, Heneka. It's a pleasure to be on this call.
Yes, and how is it in India? You are in India this time.
Well, it's a good time of the year, not too hot, though we're close to 30 degrees Celsius, or I would say about 90 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you who don't use the metric system. But, it's probably the best time of the year to come and visit, and really looking forward to the year ahead.
All right. So I have a fun question for you, Amar. And the fun question is, if you were to eliminate one thing from your daily schedule, what would it be and why?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Who should be answering this, me or my wife? The one habit I would love to eliminate, and that's something that I'm doing partly right now, Heneka, is once you enter the bedroom, the cell phone goes into airplane mode. I do use it as an alarm clock, so it's still probably about 5 feet away from where I sleep. But our goal is that by the end of this month, no cell phones inside the bedroom, or no screens, period.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much again for being on the show. I want to ask you about Kamakshi Media. We want to hear about Kamakshi Media. You're doing podcasting, branded podcasts. What is that?
That's an interesting question. So let me tell you a little bit about what Kamakshi Media is all about, right? The word Kamakshi itself has several meanings, and that's a Sanskrit word, depending on who you talk to, right? It can mean knowledge, the goddess of knowledge. It also means the goddess of wealth. So the idea was, of course, we did not get into the podcasting business, or we did not launch our startup with the idea of making a lot of money, but we wanted to share knowledge, and we wanted to create a lot of wealth in the form of knowledge. Right. So that's the sort of origin behind the name. Why podcasting? Because I've been listening to podcasts pretty much since 2004 or 2005, around the time the term was coined. And my wife has been listening to podcasts for about 7 or 8 years now. What we realized was that, you don't have the kind of quality on-demand shows in India, the likes of which I used to listen to, or, we've been listening to even now, depending on the phase of life you're at. So when I was applying to business schools, I used to listen to a lot of podcasts from, let's say, Harvard Business School or from London Business School, etc. Right? They talk about either the application process, what are the courses you should take, what are the career choices, and so on and so forth. So, till about December 2015, I was with Amazon. I used to head their fulfillment center setup here in India as a program manager here. What I realized was that it was not something that I thought was really exciting me anymore, and we really wanted to do something which would feel satisfied that I've done something great, or we have done something great, because my wife's also pretty much involved in this. And at the same time, we wanted to do something that we both enjoyed doing. And we both don't come from a media background. We don't come from a technology background. Mrunal's, my wife's been in insurance for the past 13 years. This was a great opportunity for us to learn a lot of skills. I'm sure you know it as well as anybody. And I need to tell this to you that, what it takes to launch a podcast. More importantly, what it takes to sustain a podcast, the marketing and everything involved with it. Last 14 months since we launched in January, Heneka, I can tell you, it's been a phenomenal experience. Every time we've launched a show, so we launched 6 podcasts in the past 12 months practically. When we started out, I was using literally $100 recording setup. My biggest investment was a $70 microphone. I used a 10-year-old laptop to record the first 100-odd episodes, right? We invested a lot of time in soundproofing. We innovated a lot. How do you set up a really frugal recording setup? And we did not want to do it because we are cheap, but we really wanted to find out that what it really takes to set up a very working, frugal sort of a setup. So that's been our journey so far. And, I would be happy to answer any specific questions that you may have as we go along.
Well, sure. Share with our community the experience of actually setting up. You alluded to that, but setting up a podcast. Guide us through setting up a podcast, the intensity, the work that is involved in actually doing one.
Wow, that's an interesting question. How much time do we have? Podcast somehow has the people tend to really get confused. Does it have to do something with iPod? And of course, if you talk to the millennials, they probably don't even know what an iPod is. We like to use the word on-demand audio, which really simplifies a lot of things, right? To answer even before answering your question, let me tell you 2 things to your audience. And this is something that I have learned after speaking to a lot of people. Number one question people are going to ask you when they ask you, right, at a social gathering or any other networking event or something. So Heneka, what do you do? Your answer would be, I'm a podcaster. My first question to you would be, what is a podcast? By the time you're done explaining, the second question, which will follow 99% of the time, is how do you make money?
Right. That is important.
So absolutely important. And we're still finding out what's the way to go about it. But that's where branded podcasts come into the picture. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But what it takes to set up a podcast, literally every podcast. And like I said before, right, we have launched 6 podcasts in 2016. We had over 200 episodes, more than 120,000 listens between these shows, and over 100 5-star reviews, right? So it's a short learning curve for us. It's been a steep learning curve, but I can tell you from my experience, what it takes to launch a podcast. Think of it, it's no different than launching a business. First of all, everything I like to answer using the 6 questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Think of every podcast, whether you're planning to launch just one show or you're planning to launch multiple shows, it is not going to be any different than launching a business, right? First of all, you should be very clear, why you're launching the show. Are you looking at it as a means of expressing yourself? Are you looking at it as, if you're an author, for example, are you using a podcast to grow your audience, to develop that credibility as an author, for example, to connect with your readers? If are you looking to, at certain point in time, use it as a facilitator one way or the other for your business, right? So that's the number one question that you should answer, why you want to launch it. Then comes the format, right? There are multiple formats for a podcast. Should it be discussion based? Should it be interview based? And, interview based is what we are doing. Then, should that be more like news and opinion based? Should that be more about, industry trends and analysis? Or it is something, which is completely different from, any of these that we talked about. Next is single host or multiple hosts, right? After that, it comes, what's the duration, right? 5 minutes, 20 minutes. What about the frequency? Daily, weekly, monthly? Hopefully not monthly, but
you will lose your audience, right?
You will lose your audience on day one. So, these are very important questions. There are no right or wrong answers for any of these questions, Heneka. It will totally depend on, what is it that you want to do. But the most important question, and I left it towards the very end because I think it's the number one question: who is your audience?
Exactly. Awesome.
Why should they be listening? Right? Why they should be listening? Why should they be spending so much of their time listening to the content that you're producing? And in your case, you're very clear, right, Heneka? They are, these are entrepreneurs. Your audience is very much defined. You're not going to cater to people who want to visit, one of the islands in the Caribbean on a summer vacation, right? I mean, that's a great theme for a podcast as well, but that's not your show, Heneka. Correct?
Exactly.
Then there are the technology part of it. How do I record? Do I use Skype? Do I use any of the other formats? And in fact, I experimented a lot with about 7 or 8 different ways of recording online. And, and I have a blog post titled 7 Different Ways of Recording Podcasts Online. My boss back in the United States, he used to say there are many ways to skin a cat. And somehow that phrase stuck in my mind when I was writing this particular post that, which method do I follow, right? Do I go online? Do I do off?
Amar, as you mentioned that post that you read, actually that's a post that got me connected to you. I read it, and you mentioned in that post 7 different ways to record a podcast. Now, most of us are familiar with using Skype. That's what we're on now. And then there is the Zencaster, and you mentioned some others. What are in your mind, based on your experience, the most typical ways of recording, of those 7, the most typical ways of recording the shows?
So if it is an interview-based show, I like to make it a no-brainer for the guest. Okay, so from that point of view, in this order, my top 3 choices are Skype, Zencaster, and then a site called Clean Feed. And I'll tell you why. A lot of people in India like to record their podcast interviews using their mobile phones. Okay, Clean Feed works very well on Chrome browser, which are, a lot of Android phones have, and a lot of people in India use Android phones. They do not use, Apple or Apple devices, right? So Clean Feed works very well on a mobile phone using Chrome browser.
Well, I guess we'll have to do our research to find out more about Clean Feed. And
it was actually started by a couple of audio engineers out of the UK.
And then you talk about, of course, Skype and Zencaster. What are the benefits of using one over the other?
The advantages, Heneka, are Skype. It's actually very easy for majority of the people, what Skype is and how it works, right? Just get on the call and we hit record, right? In case of Zencaster, the advantage is that a lot of people, and I have seen this more in the older population, at least here in India, they're not familiar with Skype. They don't know, how do I go about installing now, whether they're using a Windows or a Mac. It becomes a sort of a technological nightmare for me as a host to make sure that they are equipped to start using Skype. Advantage in case of Zencaster is that you can record using your web browser, so you don't have to install any software. And most importantly, which I think is really neat feature. I mean, there are 2 neat features with Zencaster. It can do some of the basic audio processing on their own, using the software within the website, right? Cleaning up and maybe normalizing the voice and things like that, right? But the sweetest thing about Zencaster is that it can save your MP3 or WAV file directly to your Dropbox account. So you automatically have a backup of the recording on the cloud.
I guess many of our on this side here are familiar with Skype, maybe a little familiar with Zencaster. Certainly Clean Feed is something that I'm sure our community will be checking out. You tested this podcast on WhatsApp. You beta tested on WhatsApp. Take us through that process, because many of us wouldn't have envisioned that is even possible.
Yeah, 6 months ago, if you would have asked me, how do you distribute podcasts to WhatsApp, I probably would not have an answer either, Heneka. So I'll tell you why we started using it. First of all, again, the philosophy that we operate the business on, make the content delivery absolutely no-brainer for the listener, right? Just the way I said that, make it easy for recording the content, make it easy for the guest to get online and record the call. On the correspondingly, for the listener, it should be a no-brainer to access the content. And I'll tell you why. Majority of the listeners in India typically are going to be in the ages of 18 to 30. Most likely, mobile phone is their only computing device, or probably the only computer that they have ever owned. And they have Android devices. Now, I'm sure you know it very well as well. Apple probably has 2 or 3 podcasting apps, right? Including the native iTunes app, and then you have Overcast and a couple of other apps, right? Android has about 15 different apps for listening to podcasts. Right? It becomes extremely complicated. Now comes the technology part, right? Well, here's the RSS feed, copy and paste it into from your browser, paste it into your app, or, run a search in your app and you will find it. This is great if you have one language. India, fortunately, has only about 22 official languages. So from a tech support point of view, imagine the amount of customer support resources that I would have needed, and we are talking about like scale, probably a couple of years down the line, right? Imagine the amount of hand holding that would have to be done. Your user manual, your screenshots, your FAQ, everything would have to be at least in 5 to 6 major languages, right? The question was, how do I eliminate so much of I call it waste because that's not the core focus of the business, right? I'm in the business of producing and marketing and distributing content. I'm not in the business of helping people learn. I'm not an education service provider, right?
Right.
I would love to help podcasters. Probably one of the reasons why we are on this call as well, Heneka. But my job is not to promote podcasts. My job is to promote my podcast, right? So how do we solve this problem? When we looked at the download numbers, right, which are the top 3 most installed apps on smartphones in India? Number 1 was WhatsApp. I forget the number 2. I think it was YouTube, but I could be wrong. Number 3 was Facebook Messenger. So we said, well, here is the idea, right? Fantastic. We already have an app which is there on close to 200 million smartphones. People, irrespective of language, age, gender, geography, they know how to use WhatsApp. So I don't have to teach them anything. What if I started sending them the summary, maybe like a couple of lines about the podcast episode and the link to the podcast episode, right? So there are 2 ways. Either I send them the MP3 file, the link to the MP3 file, or I send them the link to the web page where the podcast is embedded inside the web page, right? The advantage with the latter is that every time you listen to it, I know that you've been, I cannot identify you as an individual listener, but I know that somebody has listened to it, right? More importantly, if, people in India, they like to share content within their networks, right? So I send you one MP3 file, you share it with 50 other people. On my download statistics, it's only 1 listener, even though 51 people have listened to it probably. On the other hand, if I send you the link to the web page, and let's say the same person listened to it and they forward it to 50 other people, 50 other people also listen to it, my listener count goes up by 51. It's 51. It's no longer 1. So I can track better if I send them the link to the story through WhatsApp. So this was the basic idea. But as we started implementing it, what we realized was, my wife and I, WhatsApp in India is what mailing lists are everywhere else globally.
Interesting.
That it works exactly in the same way, believe it or not. I was really surprised that, it's such a no-brainer, but, why didn't it occur to us sooner, right? The reason is that WhatsApp, we use the broadcast message. So WhatsApp has 2, right? 2 ways of distributing content. One is the group. So it's everybody else knows who else is getting the content, right? And that's where the spamming and everything else, all the issues start. Mm-hmm. But you also get more engagement that way. The other way is the broadcast group. So you can send the same message to up to 256 people. Right. And I don't know where that number came from. And
I wanted to.
Nobody else would know where it comes from. Who else is listening? I'm sorry, right? So it becomes the one-to-many mechanism, which is exactly the same way how your newsletters work, be it MailChimp or Aweber or something, right? If you and I are subscribed to the same newsletter, you get the content, I get the same newsletter, but we don't know that, the other person is also subscribing to it. So, it has advantages when it comes to privacy. It has advantages when it comes to really knowing at the same time now who's listened to it, who has not listened to it. But most importantly, and this is where I think the real value of WhatsApp lies, Heneka. As the list grows, so we have about 500 subscribers on WhatsApp at this point in time, right? As the subscriber base grows, let's say tomorrow I have 10,000 subscribers, 10,000 divided by 4 by 250 quick math, about 40 lists. I can create 40 different lists of, I can divide them by geography. My New York, my US East Coast list, my, my Trinidad and Tobago list, for example, and I hope I get enough listeners for Baalgatha at a certain point in time from that part of the world. But now I can start sending
or your Jamaica list, or your Jamaica list. Don't forget to leave us out. Right.
No, not at all. And I'm sorry, I actually got confused. I somehow thought you were from there because I think my good friend Angel Jones is from there.
Oh, so, yeah? Okay, no, I'm actually in Jamaica.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Kingston, right? That's the capital of Jamaica?
Yeah.
Okay, I was just going back to sixth grade geography. So
Good thing. Good stuff.
back to WhatsApp, I can divide the lists by geography or by time zone, and then my message, I can probably set up an Excel sheet or have some software which would automatically send out the message to you in your time zone. So Baalgatha is kids' bedtime story, and let's say in Kingston bedtime is 8 p.m. You get the WhatsApp message at 8 p.m. your time. So the content delivery is also optimized for your local time zone and your preferences, rather than every other way of distributing podcast content right now. The moment I upload the file, it's the same, irrespective of your time zone, the podcast content will get updated on your device, right? I think it's getting a little technical. I may overwhelm a lot of your listeners, but I think I'll stop here. But I hope you get what I'm trying to say.
And that's awesome stuff. And I'm sure, for many of us who are in podcasting, if we have some of our listeners who are podcasters themselves, will want to check out that option that you've tested. And you've actually, shared some insight with us where India is concerned, where WhatsApp is concerned, users and methods of distributing content. Now, you alluded to two things. I picked up two things from what you've said so far. You've said many things which are of interest to us, but two of the things that you mentioned was, one, you got to make it easy for your guests to come on board, and two, make it easy for the listeners to access the content. And those are two things that I want to highlight from there. We want to move quickly into just tell us about, the idea of a branded podcast. Why create a branded podcast, and how can it affect the bottom line for companies, for businesses?
Wow, that's an excellent question, and that answers the question number two. People would typically ask you, right? What I mentioned, how do you make money? See, again, there are probably 4 or 5 different ways to monetize podcast. Sponsorship, in product placement, affiliate. These are probably some of the more common ones, at least in the more in North America and Europe, I guess. What we realized was that in India, and this is again learning from parallel industries, right? In India, it works best both for the business and for the content creator if you actually are able to sell them the idea using something which is already existing in the market, right? So now, essentially a branded podcast is that, let's say, Heneka, you and I have a conversation, and if I were to publish this podcast and, to pick a name, Google was sponsoring this podcast, and I hope they do at some point in time. But anyway,
yes. Speak it.
It will be, the Google Entrepreneurship Series. So now, Google gets a branding. Google gets to associate themselves with the world of entrepreneurs. As the podcast grows, what is the advantage to Google? Well, Google has a lot of cloud services, right? Google apps and, from their email, and these are paid services, right? For businesses, Google Drive storage and Google invoicing, everything else within the Google family. Now, suddenly they can start offering, let's say, either discounts or something like that for entrepreneurs who are looking to set up their business. Right. So this is the advantage to a sponsor by sponsoring, a branded show. Let me give you a specific example. So, this is on just one aspect of it. There was another blog post, and I'll be happy to send you the links to that after a call. We wrote actually about a 3-part series on what are the advantages to businesses from podcasting. And one of the advantages here is a direct customer connect. So there was a startup founder here in India. He's in the energy consulting business, and he wanted to reach out to a wider pool of customers. And of course, being in startup, they did not have much marketing budget. We created a custom 6-part podcast series for them, and we exclusively used LinkedIn and Twitter to promote it to their target audience, who were like chief financial officers in manufacturing industries, right? 8 episodes over a period of 2 months. This person actually got something like 10 or 12 qualified leads, and he was able to probably get around 8 or 9 times the return on investment that this person made. Right. So that's one more aspect of a branded podcast. And you know what? The advantage to us as a podcaster was we actually got paid for it.
That's interesting. That's important.
That's the most important thing, right?
Right. And that you also, and while you're doing that, you're adding value, in terms of determining whether to do audio or video, which in your estimation in India, the podcasting that are done there, is it more audio or video or both?
Wow, that's like the $1 million question. Heneka, who are you right now? My potential audience or advertiser or potential investor? And no, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. For the advertiser, video dominates in India. Okay, about 90% of the digital content consumed in India is in form of video. In fact, we've test marketed some of our shows. So we just put up a couple of images and created a YouTube video out of the children's bedtime stories compared to a regular audio feed. YouTube probably got equivalent number of listens without any promotions, right? It was all organic, whereas we had to spend a lot of time in advertising and promoting, right? That is also the perception within the investors here in India that, one of the questions, and we are raising our seed round right now as I speak, and that's the reason why I asked you this question. And this is very important for, for people who are thinking of the podcasting business. Really understand your market very well, right? If I were to look only at parents in India or like all the shows that we are thinking, had we focused only on India to begin with, we should have gone with video, because that's where most engagement is happening. That's where the most downloads or listens, as the cases, are happening. But what we also decided to do was we actually segmented the audience by age groups. Right. And we do all our shows right now in 2 languages. Eventually, we're going to do that in 4 to 5 languages. The advantage that gives us is that, once I've defined my audience per, in groups of 5, geography is no longer the constraint to me. I can reach to the people of Indian origin, whether they are in Jamaica or whether they are in Japan. I can still promote that content to them. So my audience becomes a lot more global. And of course, themes like romance or themes like, marketing and things like that, some of the shows that we are planning down the line, geography is no longer the constraint. It's a matter of content discovering the audience and audience discovering the content. But if I were to look only at the Indian market, if I'm not in the video business, I think I would be making a mistake business-wise.
Oh. Your final words to persons listening or peak performers listening who are contemplating starting a podcast. Your final words to our community.
Be very clear why you want to do the podcast. I think, out of the 6 questions, who, what, when, where, why, how, I think the why is most important. Podcasting is not easy. It sounds great. It's got a glamour quotient attached to it. I hope at certain point in time, a lot of money also attached to it. It's a lot of hard work. When I started out, it used to take me about 8 hours of my time for every 1 hour episode. That's a lot of investment by the time your file is ready. And I'm not even talking about the amount of time required in marketing it. So probably, double the time. That's 2 working days for a 1 hour content, right? And if you have a weekly show, practically you only have 3 working days left then, It is going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of hard work. But at the end of the day, once you start getting the reviews, there is nothing, no greater positive feeling than seeing that 5-star or a 4-star review on iTunes and somebody telling this is exactly what I was looking for, or it solved a problem that I was faced with, right? Wait for those reviews. Until then, just keep going at it.
Highlight of that, make sure you're solving a problem. Once you're solving a problem, you're good to go. We spoke of, Amar, in our pre-interview chat, of a giveaway that you have for our community. So I want you to go ahead and share that right now with them.
Heneka, first of all, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you also to your listeners. I spoke about 7 ways to start a podcast. What I would also like to do is that if you go to our website, kamakshi-media.in, there's going to be a page, kamakshi-media.in/podcast. There, I would include the link. It's not just 7 because by now there are, I did not mention about podcasting apps. So there are about 10 to 12 different ways that you can actually go ahead and record and create your podcast. I will also include the list on how I schedule the interviews. What's the workflow like, right? And more importantly, what are some of the tools that you could take a look at to, help set up your podcast and probably promote it as well.
Thank you so much. And Amar, it's a pleasure to be having you on this episode of the Entrepreneurial You. You've been very insightful, even to me, you have provided some insight, and I know that I can use as I develop this podcast into a brand that is recognizable. We're already catering to Caribbean entrepreneurs and persons desiring to be entrepreneurs. So thank you so much for your time. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to leave your contact information, like your Twitter handle and if you're on Instagram and your website, so that persons or listeners or community can get in touch with you.
On Twitter, I am at Gatha Story, and that's spelled GAATHASTORY, Gatha Story. On Instagram, I'm at Gatha Story _podcast. And the best way to reach me is by email. You can write to me at amar@amarvyas.in, and that's AMAR@AMARVYAS.in.
Thank you so much, and all the very best to you and everything that you're involved with, and I wish you much success.
Well, thank you so much. And, that's a fantastic initiative you have started, and I hope you go great miles with that, Heneka.
If you've enjoyed this free podcast, please show your love and support by heading over to henekawatkis-porter.com and click in the subscribe in iTunes button. Leave your rating and review, and hopefully you will leave us a 5-star rating. We would really love that. Thank you to our peak performers for tuning in. Until next time, I'm Heneka Watkis-Porter. Remember, you were born to win, but to be a winner, you must plan to win, prepare to win, and expect to win. Walk good.